Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Kurt Malchow, and I coordinate the 2014 California Department of Fish and Wildlife Climate College. Thank you for joining us today in this 5th out of 7 class of the course. This class was made possible through the mutual participation of the U.S. Geological Survey and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. We also wish to thank the California Department of Water Resources for providing the facility for today's discussion. Just some housekeeping. For live attendees, please sign in and mute your cell phones. The majority of our participants will be using WebEx, and those users will be muted for recording purposes, but can communicate with us through the chat feature following the presentation to submit any questions or comments. And some reminders for CDFW staff, please register for credit, and reminders of specifics on the course. Non-CDFW participants, please also register to receive automatic reminders for ensuing classes. Today we have a department colleague, Debbie Hazeltine-Nielsen, with us to co-moderate the Q&A session to better cover the connection between lecture topics and marine region activities. Debbie is the Marine Region Research Partnership Coordinator for the department and also works on the State Wildlife Action Plan, the integration of fisheries and marine protected areas, and climate change issues. We also have here at the bottom of the slide a sample list of issues to help consider how the course material can benefit our work. This is meant to complement, not supplant, any questions you have for the presenter and his material. We have additional course details on our webpage. Recordings for the first 4 classes have been posted, so please visit this page for any updates and, of course, review. We are continuing in the lecture series of physical changes to marine systems from climate change. As a quick recap, over the past couple of months, we've heard presentations focusing on climate impacts to wind, weather, currents, ocean temperatures, coastal fog, hypoxia, and ocean acidification, with some discussion on the potential effects of these changes on marine ecology. We are pleased to have Dr. Tom Suchanek speaking today, who also gave a presentation for our Climate 101 course around a year and a half ago. In this class, Tom will provide an update to some of the global climate change information and projections since his initial presentation, especially information that has been released within the past few months and weeks, and then focus primarily on the impacts of sea level rise and storm-related impacts to physical coastal systems, species, and ecosystems. First, an introduction. Trained as a coastal marine ecologist, Tom Suchanek is currently a scientist emeritus with the USGS Western Ecological Research Center here in Sacramento, California, and climate science coordinator for the USGS Southwest Climate Science Center based in Tucson, Arizona. Tom earned his bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Connecticut, his master's in ecology and evolution from Stony Brook University, his Ph.D. in zoology from the University of Washington, and a postdoctoral stint at the West Indies Marine Laboratory in St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. In January 2014, he retired from his position as research manager, lead scientist, and climate change science coordinator with the Western Ecological Research Center. Tom spent 20 years as a research ecologist and lecturer at the University of California, Davis, where he also served as the Western Regional Director of the Department of Energy's National Institute for Global Environmental Change for 8 years. He retired from UC Davis in 2001 and spent several years as branch chief of the Natural Resources Damage Assessment Program and director of the Environmental Contaminants Division at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Sacramento. And for the last decade has been with USGS, also here in Sacramento. He also serves on the Action Coordination Team of the West Coast Governor's Council on Ocean Health, which is addressing, among other issues, climate change impacts to coastal and estuarine ecosystems on the West Coast. Tom maintains research associate appointments at UC Davis with both the Bodega Marine Laboratory and Department of Wildlife, Fish, and Conservation Biology. He has produced over 150 publications, including peer-reviewed journal articles, reports, and a book. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Suchanek.
Thanks, Kurt. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate being invited back for the second year. Thank you all for attending, and for all of you on the WebEx as well. What I'd like to do today is to update you on some things. First, I wanted to do some thanks to various people who I've stolen slides from, or stolen data from, or figures from, quite a number of people from USGS, especially Patrick Barnard, who is working continuously and aggressively on effects of storm, surge, and extreme weather events on coastal ecology or coastal physical geomorphology of the California coast, and to fill mode for some of the other data that I have in here, and several other people have contributed. So thanks to all those folks as well. What I'd like to do today is to provide some updates on the IPCC projections for the Assessment Report 5, which is in the process of coming out since the last talk about a year and a half ago. Do some recent also some recent climate assessment reports that came out within the last couple months. But then start addressing sea level rise impacts, some El Nino influence, additive effects of storms, some biological, ecological impacts, and one of my goals here is to provide some resources for CDFW and some of the web-based user-driven tools that you guys can access. So throughout the talk, I will be providing URLs on the WebEx itself, on the PowerPoint, so that you can look back and access any of those tools that interest you. In addition, the last thing I'd like to do is to do a demonstration of a really cool and very neat tool by NOAA, which is a Coastal Sea Level Rise and Flooding Impacts Viewer. Very sophisticated, very complete. Doesn't have everything, so you might need to go to a couple different tools, but primarily it's, I think, the go-to tool for coastal sea level rise impacts assessment. So with that, I'll start out with discussing some of the things that have happened since the last presentation, and that is the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. The Working Group 1 report, which is basically the physical science basis, came out in September of 2013, and a number of the slides and updates I will be providing are from that. The Working Group 2 report was just released in March 31st on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. The Working Group 3 was just released in draft form, and it's in review right now. That's on mitigation of climate change. And the synthesis report, I believe, will be out by November. So all four of the pieces and parts will be out by November of this year. Also just released last week was the Climate Change Impacts in the United States report by the National Climate Assessment Program, U.S. Global Change Research Program. That is filled with really great stuff, and we'll update you on things that have happened along with the IPCC Fifth Assessment. The URL for that is down at the bottom here, and you can go there on your leisure. What I'd like to do now is to sort of recap some of the older scenario approaches that were used in the fourth assessment by IPCC. And those were using a different kind of model than they're using now. So initially, first I need to make sure that we all understand the metrics here and that we're using. This figure presents CO2 emissions on a global scale in gigatons of carbon per year, not gigatons of CO2 per year, but actually gigatons of carbon per year. So you need to be careful about how you interpret various figures and graphs in various reports. Make sure that you know whether it's carbon or CO2, because it makes a huge difference in the values. So right now, there we go. So about 2000, they started with some of these modeling projections using the old scenarios, and at the time, there was, up until recently, they were still using the scenario B1, which is basically the scenario that identifies an integrated or ecologically friendly world. And that is basically a low-emission scenario. The next scenario is the A2 scenario, which is a divided world, and that's business as usual. We are business as usual today. And actually, we're not business as usual. I take that back. We're actually in A1FI, which is a fossil fuel-intensive mode. And, well, I'll show you some of those plots in a second here. Each one of those colors corresponds to projections from those various scenarios. In addition to the model runs, the dark circle and the open black circle, the dark circle and the open black circle are actual data that were collected by either the CO2 Information Analysis Center up here or the Energy Information Administration through EIA. And those, as you can see, exceed virtually all of the other scenario projections that we have. So obviously we need to rethink our model projections. So there's another one. So actually, that's what I just said, that these values are extremely high and not even representative of a fossil fuel intensive environment. Ignore that arrow, that's for another talk. Okay, as of April of this year, we have finally reached a full month with levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere above 400 parts per million the entire month. That's the first time that's ever happened. We reached 400 parts per million last year in 2013, just once, but now this entire month is at 400 parts per million, which is just climbing exponentially, as you can see. So we all know that carbon dioxide concentrations are increasing along in parallel with the temperature. Everybody knows that, and what we need to do is take a look at what those previous scenarios indicated with the various different conditions of the B1, the A1B, A2, and fossil fuel intensive. So, backwards here. So, if we had just the year 2000 constant, that would be this yellow line down here. The B1 low emission scenario produced a little higher result, coming up somewhere around 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade above where we are now. The A1B, which is considered a middle-of-the-road scenario, produces something closer to 3 degrees average. And business as usual, which is the A2 scenario, produced something on the order of 3.5 degrees average with a large range possible. The last one is actually the fossil fuel intensive scenario, A1FI, which is not represented over here on this figure, but the range is somewhere around 4 degrees, the increase with a large range up to about 6.5 to 7 degrees. So those are the IPCC assessment scenarios that were used in the fourth assessment from 2007. We have the new one coming out now in 2014. So here is a comparison of the previous special report on emission scenario, SRES scenarios, the B1 and the A2 that I just described to you. The B1 is the low emission scenario, which we just looked at, about 4 degrees C. I'm sorry, that's 4 degrees Fahrenheit now. And this particular report uses Fahrenheit instead of centigrade, which is going to be a lot higher. So the SRES A2 scenario is business as usual, which gets up to about 8 degrees centigrade Fahrenheit higher. But now, instead of using the SRES scenarios, we have moved now to what is called RCPs, or representative concentration pathways, which more accurately represents the amount of energy that's reaching the Earth's surface, which is actually watts per meter squared. So you can look at those numbers, and the RCP 2.6 is representative of 2.6 watts per meter squared hitting the Earth's surface, 4.5 watts, 8.5 watts. And just in terms of equivalency, the RCP 4.5 is pretty much equivalent to the B1, which is the low emission scenario. But that's not represented on this particular graph, unfortunately. I had to sort of mess with this a little bit to stick it in there. The RCP 8.5 is pretty much equivalent to the A1FI, fossil fuel intensive, and that's up in here, which now gets Fahrenheit degrees, gets up into about 11 degrees Fahrenheit with this mean and this range. So just be aware that we've moved from SRES scenarios over to the RCP scenarios with a very different look, but it's basically doing the same thing with a little adjustments in terms of more accuracy of how much energy is reaching the Earth's surface. So the annual mean temperature figure here back in degrees C or degrees Fahrenheit, you can just compare the one either way, is pretty much, in terms of California, this is a global figure. it pretty much matches what's happening in California, and especially in Northern California. We are projecting an increase in temperature of about 6.5, and now the RCP 8.5 is actually going higher. It's going up to about 8 degrees as a maximum instead of 6.5 degrees. So this is consistent. We are expecting a lot warmer conditions in California. In terms of precipitation, we're looking at not much of an increase, or maybe not an increase. This is in some of the earlier model runs. We've seen that about half of the runs are above zero and half of the runs are below zero. So we're not really sure whether we're going to anticipate increased precipitation or decreased precipitation over the long run. So just quickly with the new RCP scenarios, I just wanted to make you aware of that and just see how consistent it is with what's happening in California. So here's just some U.S. continental. Whoops, let me get back here. The U.S. continental representations for temperature increase for RCP 2.6. You can see the temperature change difference down here in Fahrenheit, 4.5, RCP 6.0, and 8.5. And you can see California is up in the somewhere in the 6 to 7 degree range of increase in this RCP 2.5 scenario. So let's start talking a little bit about physical ocean changes with climate change. Now, Nate Mantua and Art Miller and Francisco Chavez did a really nice job with their presentations the last couple of talks, incorporating El Nino, upwelling, and those kinds of processes. But I'd like to provide just a little bit of an update. And we all know that upwelling occurs primarily on the west coast of major continental landmasses, and certainly in the south, where Francisco comes from, in Peru, as well as up through Central America, as well as the U.S. We see enormous amounts of upwelling during normal years. With El Nino, that northerly wind that blows down the coast is suppressed, and the movement of surface waters offshore with the movement of upwelling water that's high in nutrients and very cold is suppressed as well. So we don't get the nutrients, which then we also have a suppression of phytoplankton, zooplankton, all the way up the food chain, the food web, to higher level predators like birds and mammals. We see bird populations crashing during those El Nino years. So that's because it slows the upwelling, because these winds decrease significantly, and we don't get this movement of water up and out to the ocean with the Coriolis effect. So normally we get the cold, deep water coming to the surface and hitting the warm air, and we get this thing called fog, which is actually very useful and helpful for most of the coastal communities, especially the redwoods. Huge amount of diversity in the redwood forest, and that is largely due to a lot of the moisture that provides water for those communities. So there's been a lot of talk about El Nino. Are we going to have an El Nino in 2014 or not? So in Lecture 2, strain my brain here a little bit. So in Lecture 2, Nate Mantua, he made a bold prediction. He says, chances of a strong El Nino are at 50% with an undetermined intensity. That's a pretty bold statement, I guess. Either it is or it isn't going to happen. But he also indicated very accurately that the prediction barrier time frame is about May, June, which is right where we're starting now. So not really able to make much prediction in terms of El Nino up until about this point. And then in Lecture 3, Francisco Chavez made another bold prediction. He thought personally, this year's El Nino would be rather small based on what he's seen. However, since that time, NOAA just came out last Thursday, and predicted a greater than 65% chance of a strong El Nino this year. So we're starting to move along that track, and basically they're basing a lot of that on the buildup of sea surface temperature anomalies in the tropical Pacific. So we're here right now in May. These are 3-month averages. So this is for March, April, May, June, May, June, July. So these are 3-month running averages for the predictions and projections for sea surface temperatures using different model runs. And you're seeing increases in those temperatures as we go through the year until the end of the year in December. Now, the projections for either an El Nino, a neutral state, or a La Nina are represented over here in red, and you can see the same 3-month running average projections over time. The probability of having an El Nino is in red, and that's increasing up to maybe almost 80% by October, November, December. These are model runs, of course. And the probability of a neutral situation is decreasing through the year, and the probability of a La Nina is very, very low, less than maybe 3 or 4%. So it's looking more and more through these model runs that we're having the likelihood of an El Nino, maybe a strong El Nino this year. It's still uncertain when the El Nino will develop or at what intensity it will develop, but NOAA's projections on sea surface temperature and ENSO events are updated weekly, and you can see them at their ENSO Watch website at the URL down here. It contains current conditions, historical information, outlooks, expert discussions, and other educational materials on ENSO in general. So go visit that site so you can keep up to date on what's happening. So sea level rise is clearly something that is affecting us all and will already and will continue to do so. This is from the National Research Council report that came out in 2012 on the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, and California. And it identifies the major processes that are involved in controlling sea level. Up north, we have isostatic rebound from the time when the glaciers covered the area around Washington. So the land surface now the land mass is actually raising up in response to not having all that weight and pressure on it from the glaciers. So that land mass is going up. Relative to sea level, that means the sea level is going down. So sea level rise up in the north, in Washington area, in an absolute sense, is maybe going up, but in a relative sense, it's not going up as fast as other places. So in the south, in Southern California especially, we have groundwater withdrawal, and that tends to make the land come down in subsidence because there's missing space in there. So the land is sinking here, it's rising here, and that will control the differences between sea level, absolute sea level, up in the north versus in the south. There's lots of other things that impact sea level and sea level rise, especially the temperature increases in the poles and in colder areas with glaciers. And in reality, about 50% of the sea level rise is coming from expansion of the water itself in the ocean, and about 50% is coming from the glaciers and ice caps. So that's roughly equivalent. Doug Marcy from NOAA put together some global estimates of sea level rise from a whole variety of different papers that have come out in the past years. And again, these are global estimates. Rowing et al., all the way up to about almost 2.5 meters increase. Average height, average low is down here. All the way down to Baer et al., which is less than maybe about 0.5 meters of sea level rise. So we can look at those, and those just give you an idea, a rough idea, a global idea of the range of papers and the range of estimates that have been done. Now, regional estimates, just interesting to compare San Francisco and California with other places like North Carolina, Washington, Puget Sound, Maryland, North Carolina, Maine. So we're kind of right up in the upper range here of anticipated sea level rise, both for the highs and for the lows. So that's a piece of information for you. You can just take that for what it's worth. But again, the National Research Council report in 2012 did a nice job of identifying differences over time for 2030, 2050, and 2100 for both Washington, Oregon, and California. And then a few other things like the Ramsdorf and Vermeer paper in 2009, which is sort of used as the standard amongst many of the resource agencies actually for requiring information on sea level rise in their reports. vulnerability assessment. So if we look here in 2030, the NRC report indicated that by 2030 we'd be looking at somewhere around 25 to 30 centimeters in sea level rise increase. In 2050, California will be seeing somewhere around 60 centimeters, up to 60 centimeters of sea level rise. And for 2100, California might be seeing up to 1.6 meters sea level rise. So that's kind of where those were in 2012. Very nice analysis. Now, using the RCP, Representative Concentration Pathways assessments with the watts per meter squared, in the new IPC assessment, these are the projections for temperature, for sea level, and very similar looking to those for temperature, up to about 1.5 meters. But then they actually went through this. Chevrogia et al. In 2012 went through and actually did the analysis for the year 2500. So 2100 versus 2500, and with 2500, you'll be sad to hear that we're looking at maybe 11 meters of sea level rise. This is on a global scale. So that's just not. You don't have to worry about that. Maybe your triple grandchildren will, but it's just interesting to see them project out that far. We're kind of projecting here. So that's 2100. This is all fluff. I don't know how many of you have been watching the news lately. Yesterday, NASA had a news conference in which they announced a 40-year data set revealing that the western half or the western region of the Antarctic ice sheet collapses in process. Unfortunately, that's a lot of ice, a lot of water, and they're projecting that will create an additional 13 feet of sea level rise. Not immediately. It's probably going to take several centuries, but if you look at the previous slide with that projection to 2500, we're likely to see this process contributing significantly to that. And in addition to the news conference, there was an article in the New York Times yesterday, and it's a lead article on the front page of the New York Times today on this data set and the projections that are happening. And what's interesting is that El Nino events also affect sea level. When we look at the various different big El Ninos that occurred in the 1915-16, 40s, 50s, 80s, and then the 90s, each one of those saw sea level rise significantly. And if we analyze those, it looks like sea level rises about 10 inches higher during those times on average than in non-El Nino years. So it's affecting a lot of different aspects of ocean processes. Now let's look at the West Coast in particular. The West Coast sea level rise has been suppressed, sorry about the misspelling there, for the last 30 years. But the wind patterns may be changing. You can see that it's just sort of stalled there a little bit in the last 30 years. But wind patterns changes may signal a return to either global levels of sea level rise or higher rates. It can't go on like this forever. We're not exactly sure what's going on, but this is accurate for the West Coast, for California. This is work done by Pete Brominski from USGS in a paper that he put out in 2011. So what's happening with some of the estuary regions? So in the past, like 1849, we had a bay that had wetlands around the perimeter. In present day, we have levee construction and development, which has eliminated many of those wetland areas. And so the question, what's happening is that's not very clear. Sea level rise is inundating low elevation areas, unprotected, and then with levee areas, there have been quite a number of breaches in the past. So what's going to happen with those is all those animals are burrowing into the levees. We don't have enough money to rebuild them. This is going to be happening on a more and more frequent basis. So 2100, based on projections of sea level rise, we could see we could see the development of additional wetlands, which originally were there, and as the water moves up, may reclaim some of this land, but only in those cases where the shoreline is not armored, it's not protected, there's no seawalls, there's no human influence in infrastructure there. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. This is information from Josh Collins in the San Francisco estuary. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean that was from another talk. Storm impacts are clearly to be reckoned with, and we should start with talking about the wave heights. Wave heights are increasing, and they're increasing in an interesting way. This figure here shows latitudinal gradient from Washington, Oregon, Point Arena in Northern California, all the way down to Southern California for each one of those figures. And you can see here not only that the sea level is higher up there, I'm sorry, we're on the wave height. Wave height is higher up there than it is down here. Here it's upwards about 4 meters, and here it's down about 2.5 meters. But also the slopes here, you can tell by the equations, the slopes are also greater slopes up here than they are down here. And what's interesting is that the increase in wave heights happening at a more rapid rate up in Washington, Oregon, than it is down here in California. Also in the Pacific Northwest, the average winter wave height is increasing at about 10 centimeters a year. That's phenomenal. So over the 30-year period, roughly, of these figures, it's increased about 3 meters over that time period, which if you translate that into wave energy, it's equivalent to about an 80% increase in wave energy. That's in the Pacific Northwest, but not necessarily down here, but we don't know what's going to happen with future processes. So what are the physical and geomorphic impacts of storms? Well, how do we define an extreme storm? It's involved with a lot of things. There's no specific definition for an extreme storm, but it certainly is incorporating wave height and wave energy, wind speed and direction, atmospheric pressure. Clearly, if you have a high-pressure system moving in, nice weather, calm, the atmosphere is actually pushing down on the sea surface, so it's going to be a lower tide, both low and high tide. If you have a low-pressure system coming in, it's not pushing down on the ocean so much, so the water is going to be higher, physically higher during the various tidal cycles. The wave direction is important for any specific local or regional area. The storm duration is important. What's the beach state and what's the water level? So all of these things together are important in defining what an extreme storm means. In terms of conditions, we often will see during an extreme storm elevated tide levels to about 2 meter variation, wave heights up to about 10 meters, about 30%, 33% of those are about 10 meters, and maybe 1% of those waves are up to 15 meters high. Pretty significant. Storm surge, which is the water that's being blown by wind across the surface of the ocean. That increases to, adds about 30 centimeters to the water level. And then wave setup, which is the water that's blown up onto the shore and remains there as waves keep pounding in. So the wave setup is an important component, and that's up to about 1.7 meters. So all of these factors have been incorporated into a model called Cosmos by Patrick Barnard from USGS. And this is information from one of his slides and some of his Cosmos work. And I'll show you a little bit more about that later. So what are some of the impacts that we see? So this is a pair of photographs from UC Santa Barbara. And I guess you can probably read that pretty well, but this is a picture in 1975, just before an El Nino. You can see a volleyball court down here. Here's a little cement barbecue pit. And after the 1983 El Nino, that shoreline was completely wiped out, absolutely, and now there's just cliffs there. So it's very impressive what a single powerful El Nino can do. So we need to really take notice of these things. So what's happening in some other areas, like Huntington Beach down in Southern California? This is intertidal zone here. So if we get any increase at all in the sea level height or increase in storm surge or increased wave action, these places are definitely at risk. Physical infrastructure, this is Malibu, California, same thing. They're also in, a lot of really expensive homes down here, but they won't be very expensive as sea level starts to rise. So also other infrastructure like power plants that are potentially at risk with sea level rise. San Francisco Bay, we have several power plants here. We have oil and gas facilities, landfill gas, municipal solid waste facilities, and megawatt power plants, all the way down. We have lots of different things that could be potentially affected in infrastructure. Here's the Hyperion wastewater treatment plant in LA. These are the treatment ponds, and as Patrick Barnard likes to say, it's a gravity-fed system, and you don't want to see what happens when the sea level starts rising, because it's not going to go in the direction you think it's going. So that would be of concern if I lived in that area, for sure. And then San Onofre Nuclear Power Plant. This shoreline, there is a barrier there, but it's very much at risk from sea level rise. It's right on the coast, as opposed to the Diablo Canyon plant. Some of the reactors are going to be decommissioned, but we're not sure exactly what's going to happen after that. Some airports are clearly vulnerable to storm surge, and I will be showing you some of that impact later. Oakland International Airport, San Francisco International Airport, Honolulu Airport, all of these, along with many of the other ones along the coastal regions of the U.S., are definitely at high risk, and we'll see some of that up close. Here's the San Francisco Airport. A little damp there, but this slide was intended to indicate some of the pipelines: crude oil, gas, natural gas, jet fuel, diesel, gasoline, all would be potentially impacted. So another thing that we need to decline. Okay, thanks. You'll also take over my house here. Sea level clearly is not the same everywhere. Sea level is not sea level is not sea level. Sea level rise is actually greater in the western Pacific than it is in the eastern Pacific. And part of that is undoubtedly due to the circulation of currents in the ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, in a clockwise fashion in the northern hemisphere, and in a counterclockwise fashion in the southern hemisphere, piling up against the western region of the Pacific. But in a closer look, we have very, very large differences in sea level height, say between Washington and Southern California. There's about an 8-foot difference in this along this stretch. In addition, if we look in San Francisco Bay, we have about a 4-foot difference between the South Bay and up in Suchanek Bay, which the South Bay being higher. So that area is clearly much more at risk than other areas in the Bay from sea level rise. This particular figure here is from NOAA's Sea Level Rise and Coastal Flooding Impacts Viewer, which I will be showing you a demonstration of at the end. So let's take a look at some of the real infrastructure. You've probably seen this before, but it's worth reviewing at this point. Some of the South Bay projections. This is Route 101. Palo Alto is up in here. These are some of the, here's the bay right here, that blue. So if we take a closer look at this with 100-year storm surge, this is what it looks like, the blue. There's the bay, but all of this, assuming that levees and seawalls are constructed and not working, this light blue area is the area that is going to be flooded, right over 101. If we look at the 50-centimeter increase for sea level, that adds this little blue, light blue ring, little light blue ring around here, and the yellow is for a 100-centimeter increase in sea level, and the red is for a 150-centimeter increase all the way out to here. So what is down there? We're approaching Silicon Valley. So we've got Intuit, Google, Yahoo, NASA, Intel, and for those people who have iPods, iPhones, iPads, iTVs, you're probably okay, because here's Apple down here. It's in Cupertino, so you can rest assured. How many people have Apple stock? All right, there you go. All right, so go out and buy Apple stock. My son works for Apple, so that'll be good. So let's look at some summary notes here for West Coast trends. Global sea level rise, probably looking at 1.6 meters or greater by 2100. Winter wave height is increasing at 1 to 3 centimeters per year. Extreme wave height increasing at about 10 centimeters per year. Wave surge is increasing, especially in the north, in Washington and Oregon area. And there's an increase in the magnitude and frequency of storms. Not a good projection. And a lot of this is, again, Patrick Barnard's work. So let's now, instead of, rather than focusing on physical, let's start looking at biological, ecological impacts. What we need to realize and understand and take into consideration is that climate change will happen in the face and in concert with all of the other stresses that we've already been looking at for the past 25 to 50 years, really. We've thought about overfishing, contaminants, invasive species, land use change and development. Now, we have to add to that list ocean acidification, eutrophication, hypoxia, red tides, methane releases, all the things that are associated with climate change. So now we've got a bigger basket of things that we need to be worried about and to take into consideration in our vulnerability assessments and our management plans. So starting with primary productivity and related processes, kelp beds. Kelp beds are extremely important. We know that they provide habitat and cover and act as nursery grounds for many species of both invertebrates and fishes. And some of the work that's been coming out indicates that increased storm frequency and intensity could be significantly detrimental to kelp beds. The two main kelp beds that we have are Macrocystis, which is the giant bladder kelp, or Nereocystis, which is the bull kelp. And so we need to be cognizant of that, as these are nursery grounds and breeding grounds for many of the important nearshore species, both in open ocean areas as well as in nearshore areas, estuaries as well. So very important to keep in mind that these are things that are at risk. Harmful algal blooms. There was one that was on the screen earlier today, but harmful algal blooms are definitely with us. They're increasing at a rapid rate, and they're causing toxic shellfish poisoning. And we need to be understanding why they're occurring at a more rapid rate. And there's lots of reasons associated with climate change. Temperature changes after alter ecological processes, species interactions, increases and decreases in sunlight, change cloud cover and radiation. That all affects biological reactions. Changes in precipitation alter freshwater runoff and inputs of nutrients, sediment, and contaminants. Alteration of wind and water circulation patterns influences geographic distributions of species and upwelling of nutrients. Changes in stratification of the water column impacts vertical migration of some of these species. Increases in carbon dioxide availability affect phytoplankton productivity, and ocean acidification influences species of assemblages and processes. So many things that are incorporated in these processes that are being affected by climate change also are affecting the algal bloom increase that we're seeing. There's some evidence that harmful algal blooms are occurring more frequently with warmer water. Might find them in an ocean, but I put this figure up basically to show along the coastal U.S. The number of events, proportional comparative events that are paralytic shellfish poisoning. California has some of the highest, meaning some of the largest of these icons, similar to up in Maine, but we definitely have lots of those: paralytic shellfish poisoning, amnesic shellfish poisoning, and brown tides, and many other things associated with harmful algae. NOAA has a HAB program focusing on 3 different areas of research. One is ecology and oceanography of harmful algal blooms. That's EcoHab. I've left the website here for you. Monitoring and event response for harmful algal blooms, MARHAB. and HAB prevention, control, and mitigation. Again, another website to go through if you want to see more about what NOAA is doing in HABs. Phenological changes in coastal marine species. There isn't a lot that's been done already on the West Coast, but on the East Coast, they're starting to identify changes in the latitude. Many of these species are moving north and can be identified. The lobster is one of them as well. In addition to moving further north, the American lobster, the Maine lobster, interestingly molted 15 to 30 days earlier in 2012. Now that's phenomenal in 1 year change. Now I'm not sure if they're doing anything this year, but that's clearly out of the norm for Maine lobsters. We'll have to keep up with that. The person who's running the National Phenology Network with USGS, Jake Welton, great guy. He's the director of that program. I spoke with him recently. They really don't have much in the way of West Coast phenology information and data on for marine systems. They have a lot for terrestrial. They don't have hardly anything for marine, although they're developing that now, and within the next few months they're going to be adding it to their NPN, the National Phenology Network website. Another useful tool is the OBIS, the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, and this is where you can reach that. So you can look at different species, what's happening to them, if they're moving, if they're migrating north or south. Rocky intertidal organisms, we're seeing changes in distributions. In Monterey Bay, many of the invertebrates over a 60-year period looks like they're shifting their ranges further and further north, probably in response to a warmer ocean and air temperatures. It's a classic study that was done by Barry et al. And mussel beds are clearly a very prominent feature along our shorelines. Mussel beds are very thick in some places, many multi-layers thick, and they actually have been documented to contain over 300 species of associated organisms in the bed itself. We've got limpets, barnacles, algae, sea stars, even some fish that live in there. So this is something I did back in the 70s, was identify the community of organisms that live in and on and under and around the mussel bed as a refuge for, and as a habitat for other species. So one of the studies from Smith et al. In 2006, published in Ecology, noted large declines in the community associated with mussel beds, somewhere between 60 and 70% in Southern California. They've lost many rare species in the mussel bed, and the biodiversity is probably related to ocean productivity and climate. So there are major changes happening in those communities, and we're losing a lot of species in that 300 original species complex. So more things that are affected biologically, ecologically. The sooty shearwater makes tremendous migrations. Sooty shearwater concentrates during the summertime up here in California, especially around Monterey Bay. All those dots are individual sightings of sooty shearwater, and they bulk up on anchovies and food resources, fat stuff, and then migrate down virtually 7,000 miles all the way down to New Zealand, where they lay their eggs and raise their young. That's a huge trip, and then they've traveled all the way back again the next year to bulk up again so that they can make that journey back and supply enough food for their young and themselves. What happens during an El Nino year, when we get a diminishing of those nutrients coming to the surface, is that we don't get those fish, and we don't get the nutrients, and we don't get the higher level trophic species. And those sooty shearwaters and many other bird species crash in that reproductive year. So careful what we have here. Management and adaptation strategies. I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on there. Benet Duncan, from a postdoc with NOAA and USGS, finished an Ocean Climate Indicators report looking at monitoring and tracking climate change in the north central California coast. The region was from Point Arena down to Point Año Nuevo, and includes the Farallon Islands nuclear waste dump site. That is there too. That's a different project. Farallon Islands, Gulf of the Farallon National Marine Sanctuary. So in the entire area, not inside the bay, but just on the outside on the outer coast. So basically it involved about 50 regional, federal, state resource managers and ocean scientists developing both physical and biological indicators for climate change and what should be monitored over time and how often that should be monitored. So you might want to take a look at that. I've provided the URL up here for that. Wow, great report. Fog and climate change. Now, Nate and Art and Francisco did a good job on the fog. And as you can see, over the last century, fog has been diminishing over time to the present, sort of leveled out there, but it's been going down for that entire time. Fog is important, as we talked about earlier, in terms of providing moisture to these coastal communities like the Redwoods, rejuvenating the water table and providing the basis for growth. The fact that fog is declining is a concern because we have some places, for instance, in the Channel Islands, where you've had alien species come in and almost completely denude the islands. We've got deer, elk, pigs, cattle that have almost completely removed most of the native vegetation. So fog will be fine in rejuvenating the water table if there's something up into the air column to capture it. And you see, even just this lichen up here is capturing fog and returning the moisture to the ground. What Catherine is doing as an adaptation strategy is trying to capture fog with artificial devices and maybe rejuvenate some of the plants that can be then grown, which naturally then will go up into the air column and then be able to capture air by itself, and then we don't have to do anything artificial. So in the short term, we may be able to use an adaptation strategy to then return that system back to its original or close to its original status by using these drip samplers. Another project which is trying to use an adaptation strategy is that of John Takakawa and Karen Thorne from USGS, looking at different species in salt marshes, black rail, salt marsh harvest mouse, and clapper rail, California clapper rail. All three of these are listed species: federally endangered salt marsh harvest mouse, federally endangered clapper rail, and federal species of concern and state threatened black rail. They live in different habitats. The mixed vegetation is Salicornia, pickleweed, and the Spartina down here. And what they're trying to do is to understand what sea level rise, how it's impacting some of these species in the marshes. Dr. Cow and his group are looking at 12 different marshes around San Francisco Bay, and let me focus on one of them. That's Petaluma Marsh here, and that's the shape of it. I've shown this before, but I think it's worth going over again. Water level is at about 2.0 meters. This is what it looks like with the marsh below, and this is the vegetation layer here. It's a pickleweed forest primarily. And when we look at the black rail, these are the home ranges. The yellow is the home ranges, and the little hatch marks are the core use areas. So using just what's happening right now, no climate, no sea level rise increase, just the tidal flux that's happening now. When it's 35% inundated, this is where the water is in those areas. Now think back, so keep those home ranges and those core use areas burned in your brain. As we move through this, that's 35% inundation with current tidal levels. That's 90% inundation, 99% inundation. Where have the home ranges gone and the core use areas? They're gone. Unless they're going to focus on this little pinnacle over here or this over here, they're out of luck because birds don't breathe too well underwater. So what's happening is that those birds have to vacate the marsh. And there's hawks and there's foxes that are right at the edge in the forest areas and the forested areas and vegetated areas that are just waiting at high tide, especially on the king tides, for these species to come out and nail them. So what can we do to preserve them in the meantime until we can figure out something better? What will happen with sea level rise? Well, another group, Mike Casaza at USGS, built some of these blinds. They're hollow in the middle, and they hope that these little floating islands would encourage the clapper rails to occupy them, and literally 2 hours after they put out some of these blinds, clapper rail has occupied them, and they actually bred. So a really neat way to help them along until something better can happen, or maybe build mounds in some of these marshes where they can seek refuge with vegetation. After that, they concentrated on building smaller habitats for the rails, and they move up and down on these poles during high tide and low tide, and they're still working on this process now. So another adaptation strategy that may work for the short or medium term. So there's lots of interactive tools that can be used and are out there available to anyone, especially for identifying and evaluating sea level rise in different areas. CalAdapt has one. There's Climate Central has one that's a Surging Seas, Submerging Seas map. This is an art project. I put it in here because it's interesting. What kinds of art have they developed for sea level rise and for the kids in San Francisco? It's kind of neat. You might want to take a look at it. The Nature Conservancy has Coastal Resilience for Ventura County. PRBO and USGS has our Coast Our Future, which I'm going to feature in a couple minutes. That goes from Half Moon Bay to Bodega Bay and uses the Cosmos modeling program. I'll show you that in a second. And then there's the NOAA Sea Level Rise tool, and that's the one that I feel is the most useful, most sophisticated. It does not have the storm impact feature that the Cosmos modeling program does. So that's, I think, one of the only things that it's missing. The Sea Level Rise tool has flooding, but it's not broken down into the various components of flooding that might contribute to sea level rise. So between the two of these, you get a really good set of tools, and you can access those at any time. So here's the Our Coast, Our Future tool, and that was done by both PRBO, which is now called Point Blue Conservation Science. Grant Ballard is the PI on that, and Patrick Barnard is the PI from USGS, who has developed the Cosmos program. Here's the website, and it's an online, user-driven decision support tool designed to understand, visualize, anticipate vulnerability to sea level and storms, which is what some of the other ones don't do. And this particular one is from San Francisco Bay to in San Francisco Bay and outside on the coast from Bodega Head to Half Moon Bay. The topics that they investigate are flooding, waves, current velocity, uncertainty levels. You can adjust the sea level rise scenarios for a whole variety of different heights. You can adjust the storm frequency scenarios, which the other ones don't have, either an annual frequency, a 20-year, I think it's a 40-year, 60-year, 100-year, or a whole variety of storm frequency scenarios. And they've got 11 optional map layers, rivers, protected areas, buildings, utilities, land use, and the outputs are maps and or data files for all of their query runs. So this is the Cosmos modeling program. And it basically starts out with data from the latest global climate models, which is then fed into a global wave model. And then they add this tide and storm surge and scale it down to the West Coast projections to the year 2100. Then the Cosmos model steps in and adds the impact of severe storms. And that's projected onto a 2-meter by 2-meter digital elevation map. And that includes elevation, not only the water, but also the ocean floor and the shoreline to evaluate how the waves interact with the bottom to produce higher energy hitting the shore. And that produces ultimately the site-specific estimates of coastal flooding. So good tool. Take a look at it. This is what it looks like here. You can see over on the side, you can choose a topic, flooding, waves, current, uncertainty. This is current velocity, and then choose a sea level rise anywhere from 0 to 500 centimeters. You can choose a storm frequency, annual, 20-year, 100-year, and then they've got these, I think it's 11 layers that you can add to the map. So pretty useful, and but I'm not going to go further with this one. In addition to the San Francisco Bay and coastal system Cosmos modeling, they also have two other programs that they've done. One is Santa Barbara and Ventura coastal processes, and the other one is Southern California coastal hazards, all with the Cosmos modeling system. So you can pretty much do the whole state except Northern California with these, and it's a useful tool. Now, this is the Sea Level Rise and Coastal Flooding Impacts Viewer by NOAA from their Digital Coastal Services Center. It was compiled by the National Climate Assessment Sea Level Rise Working Group. And the URL is there. It's a nationally based program. They started on the East Coast, and then moved down to the Gulf of Mexico, and then just about a year to a year and a half ago, completed it for the West Coast. Not all the components are still there. They're still working on the West Coast version from Washington, Oregon, and California, but it's a really neat tool. It's a preliminary look at sea level rise, not the end all, but it's and coastal flooding. And as I mentioned, they do not include all the components of flooding. The screening level tool with consistent data does not account for erosion, subsidence, wind-driven tides, or extreme flooding events. Nor does it include the 100-year or 500-year storms, which is FEMA data. And to me, I just put it down there, I think it's ironic that our federal government does not have the authority, FEMA does not have the authority to include sea level rise impacts in their flood insurance protocols. So we'll see what we can do about that, won't we? It contains 36 different data layers, but it can only zoom into a 1/18,000th scale view, not to the parcel level, so you don't want to go to your house on the coast and try to get down to see your house. It's a little bigger than that. You can share a view. There's a little button to copy a URL and send it to somebody. Pretty easy to do. The uncertainty involved in the accuracy is based on the cumulative errors from the mapping data, the instrument precision, et cetera, all added together. So you get a good idea of how of what the precision is on that. So what I'd like to do is this is what it looks like, and I'd like to one more here. There's data that's available for the NOAA Sea Level Rise tool. You can get more information on elevation, social vulnerability, land cover. And then there's additional tools that are available on that website for not only the Sea Level Rise Viewer, but for other tools, other similar kinds of tools on marsh tools for sea level rise, etc. And they also have training modules too. When we get there, when I get to the demonstration, they have a flooding view simulator, and basically, in terms of understanding what it is, it's basically it's derived from this Canvas program, which was originally used for forest stands to see what they looked like before and after they were logged. So they used Photoshop, they used ground elevations, water levels, and reflections to simulate or emulate what a certain area, like in a city, would look like if you raised the sea level around the margin to a certain level, and I'll show you that on the demo. So at this point, I think what I'd like to do is to end the show, and then I'm going to go, I think, to what's it? Yeah. Oh. Okay. So we are now. Okay, we're now in the Sea Level Rise and Coastal Flooding Impacts Viewer from NOAA, and I wanted to show you how some of these things look in the viewer. So I want you to keep an eye. We're going to start with sea level rise. These are the choices we have up here: sea level rise, confidence levels, a marsh transition choice, vulnerability. What kind of vulnerability are we looking at for these areas in terms of physical flooding, and flood frequency for low-lying areas. So let's start with the sea level rise. For each one of these, there's a little question mark here. It's a show me question mark. You can open that up, and it gives you information on exactly what you'll be seeing in each one of those choices. You see different inundation depths, see low-lying areas, protected by levees. You can also see levees with this system. And then there's an overview down below. You can see it tells you about what's happening in that particular view, more data to understand the map, and additional information. There's links, various different things, PDFs for you to read. But the main tool is up here for all of these 5 choices. So we're looking at current mean high water as a standard, and then this slide bar here basically indicates 1 foot. Can't do that now. Anyway, doesn't work for the cursor, I guess, when I'm in there. But anyway, this is 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, and if you look over here, you can see the different areas as sea level rise increases. 4 foot, 5 foot, 6 foot. So what we want to do is maybe focus in a little bit on a couple of areas. This area here is the San Francisco Airport. This area is the Oakland Airport. And this area right here is the Alameda Naval Air Station, all of which need fairly level ground without water on them to land and take off. So let's go up here and zoom in a little closer. At the San Francisco Airport. So the green actually represents low-lying areas that are in potential risk. And as I start, this is no sea level rise here. This is just normal low-lying areas that may accumulate water during rain events, but no sea level rise. So if we just increase the sea level by 1 foot, you can see 1 foot sea level rise in the San Francisco Airport will pretty much shut it down. 2 feet is that. 3 feet, gone. 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet. So a very impressive tool to kind of project out if the sea level goes up to a certain amount, what's going to happen to these areas. Let's look out from there. Go back here, closer look at the Oakland Airport. That's already the Oakland Airport here. That's 1 foot, 2 foot, 3, 4, 5, 6 foot. So again, not looking good. And here's the Naval Air Station in Alameda, also completely flooded. So again, we're not looking at that happening immediately, but it's happening now. And it may happen faster. It is happening faster. Every time we have another IPC assessment, it seems like we're raising the bar. It's exceeding the projections that we've made in the past. So I wouldn't be surprised if sea level is actually going to rise faster in those areas than is already being projected. So let's move out a little bit. Well, let's go to this confidence level. So this is one that has, again, you can go to the Show Me button and understand all the features that are incorporated into the confidence intervals. We've got high confidence in the blue, low confidence in the orange, and areas not mapped. So as we increase, and this is the low confidence area that is going to be flooded. The blue, even with no climate change, no sea level rise rather, you can see that there's higher confidence in this area that it's going to be flooded than in these surrounding areas even with no, so 1 foot increase. The orange is decreasing. In other words, increasing confidence. More of the area is blue. More of the area is blue. More of the area is blue. Confidence is getting higher and higher as you move up into higher and higher sea level elevation rises. So pretty interesting. Marshes. It'll be, well, let's look at vulnerability first. Questions here. So it doesn't look like they're doing things in this area. One of the things that, okay, so this is the vulnerability, social vulnerability and economic vulnerability. So with the social vulnerability, high is red, sort of that light red is medium, and then the light is low vulnerability. So these are social vulnerability aspects. Basically, they've used the Bureau of Labor Statistics to get these kinds of data for businesses and for human occupancy in these different areas. So these red areas are probably more low-lying, and they're more vulnerable to sea level rise. This is the opposite. I'm actually from right there. Green Hills Country Club is up on a hill. Yep. Down. Red are high ground. Okay. Yeah, whatever that means, I'm not exactly sure. I have to look into that a little more. The economic vulnerability, I don't see, they do businesses, number of businesses, number of employees, and the wages. But I don't think that feature has been incorporated into the West Coast sea level rise tool yet, because I've looked all around and I don't see any of the economic data in the maps. So social vulnerability is there, but not the economic vulnerability. Flooding frequency. This is identifying shallow coastal flooded areas. And you can see around there, back it up. These are the areas that are indicative of shallow flooded coastal areas. Now, if we look at the marsh path, again, you can go to the Show Me button, and you can identify, understand exactly what goes into this. But I think there's 12 different land cover classes here. Everything from high-intensity developed, low-intensity developed, upland areas, freshwater forested wetland, shrub wetland, emergent wetland, saltwater marsh, unconsolidated shore, and water. So what you do is take a look at this area. Let me just go in a little closer. Brush. So as you move up in with sea level rise to 1 foot, start to see changes. And what that's showing you is, as sea level rises, you will be able to anticipate or project what kinds of communities will be found in those areas as sea level rises, and the marsh may migrate up. That is, of course, if it's able to migrate up, and we let it migrate up. But as we increase, I'll just slide it instead. You can see the changes occurring all the way up to 6 feet of sea level rise. So marshes will change, and the various different land cover classes will change in different locations as sea level increases. Factors modify. And then there's also an advanced options here. You can actually set the accretion rate for sediments at low, medium, or high, the accretion rate is is high, you're going to be able to support a different kind of community in that area. So let's set the accretion rate as high, and then that will be, transition will be much different into full-fledged marsh, as in comparison to if you didn't have any, or if you had no accretion rate or a low accretion rate. So different kinds of communities would be developed with different levels of sea level rise. So it's got a lot of bells and whistles, a lot of things you can modify and adjust as options. Kind of a neat tool. Let's see. So another thing. Back out a little bit. Level rise option. See this little icon here? It's actually an icon of a camera. And there are a number of these. This is right in the Embarcadero. So if I click on that, this is the Violet Court fountain, right in the Embarcadero, right across from where the ferry terminal is, across the street. So if we have, keep an eye on this picture here. This is the one that I told you about the changes in visual identity. So look at what the fountain looks like if we raise the sea level across the way where the ferry terminal is. As we increase it to 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, see the water go up? 6 feet. That's what the Violent Court fountain would look like with sea level rise flowing into that area. So they've got these little image icons all over the place. Not all over the place, but a number of them. There's another one up here somewhere. The town center in Madeira. So there's the town center with the walkways, sidewalk, 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet. So a lot of your businesses would be underwater at that point. So an interesting tool, kind of fun to play with it. You need a fair bit of bandwidth to operate it. And I had trouble at home, but this is very fast and nice to work with. So that's kind of an overview of the NOAA sea level rise tool. Very useful. Oh, I was going to also home in on that area near the Embarcadero. And you can do a satellite view like Google, or you can go up here and choose streets, and it will give you a map view of specific streets and the area. So over here you can see the fact that those particular streets are flooded with 6-foot sea level rise. So, neat tool, and you can see the confidence levels only on the imagery. So I think that's about it. I've provided the URLs for most of those tools and most of the sites that I've talked about for various different options, most of the different impacts that are coming from sea level rise, from storms, the various viewers, and the online user tools, hopefully to give your CDFW staff a good set of operating tools to use at their leisure. So with that, I think I'll close up, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. We have at least a half hour left for questions and any comments. We kind of have a unique arrangement here in that we have 2 mobile microphones. They are not actually hooked up to a PA system. They are meant to feed into the WebEx recording so we can archive the Q&A discussion session as well as our talk today. So in those of us live in the room, if you do have a question, Adam at the front of the table has a mobile microphone, and we always ask if there's any questions from the live audience first to give WebEx users a little bit of time to enter their questions or comments into the chat feature. So with that, do we have any questions from the room?
With your, I don't know how well you know this program that you're just showing, but do you have any idea on how well that's been validated, or what's the accuracy behind that approach? I mean, a lot of it's probably driven by elevations, so it's probably pretty straightforward.
Right. They're using global climate models, go down to the root, and I respect the team that's doing that just immensely. And they've ground truthed it on the east of Mexico, and we're getting the third generation here. Personally I'm confident that they are doing a great job and it's accurate, but they also have built in the levels of confidence that you can access to see what all of the cumulative amounts are, cumulative amounts of error are for each one of those projections. It's not my tool, but I have a lot of personal confidence that it's really a good tool.
I have a really elementary question. I apologize for those of you who are going to roll your eyes or want to when I ask it. Earlier on, you were discussing the relative sea level rise in terms of north versus south, talking about the groundwater depletion and how that's going to affect subsidence. I was wondering if that's incorporating the drought predictions in terms of draining our groundwater table, or if that's just talking about osmosis as sea level rises.
If it's affecting the projections for drought?
If drought predictions are taken into account when you discuss the overall land level decreasing and that creating a higher relative sea level rise in the south. Does that make sense? Right.
Yeah. I'm not sure, to be honest. It's a good question.
Frank Ramirez with the National American Indian Group. The impact of climate change and the increase in temperature, decrease in snowpack, the water evaporation impact. Water evaporation is the biggest loss of water in California. We get 200 million acre-feet of water. By the time you figure in the evaporation, there's probably a 35-40% decrease. Do you look at the impact on humans as an endangered species with climate increase and evaporation rate increases?
I don't know of any studies per se that's looking specifically at that. There may be. There's a lot of people working on this, especially with the California Energy Commission and associated partners with them. I don't know specifically, but that's a good point. It probably should be. Yeah, thank you for that.
I have a question for the WebEx. Are there any models that combine the coastal flooding projections with ones that use subtidal habitat mapping to determine the surge/scour impacts of storm surges in nearshore areas?
Okay. I believe that the OCOF, the Cosmos model from Patrick Barnard incorporates those features into his modeling. So that's you can look for yourself on the OCOF site, and you can look back or even contact Patrick Barnard himself, and I believe that all of those features are incorporated into his model, not into this model, but into his Cosmos model for the OCOF projects, the 3 OCOF projects.
So you were talking about the extreme storms, and I was wondering, in if you're taking together the idea of El Nino with an increase in sea level rise and an increase in storm activity that often comes with El Ninos, and put that together with this increase in sea level rise due to climate change. I mean, have they added some of those, like perfect storm type of scenarios?
Not in this, but the jury's still out on what is happening with El Ninos, whether they're actually going to increase or not. So I don't think that the modelers are really, they may be practicing and fiddling with it, but I don't think there's any, I don't know, but my guess is that there's not models that are incorporating El Nino increased frequency out there that we're using. They're probably, like I say, tuning the models to incorporate that if in fact it happens. But I don't believe that most of the regional models are using El Nino frequency and the impact of that on sea level rise to produce the outputs and the runs that they do. I think, hopefully in another 5 years maybe, we'll see what's happening with El Ninos, or maybe 10 years. But it's right on the cusp right now as to whether we believe that there's going to be more El Ninos or fewer El Ninos. But certainly the fog has been decreasing. We can't tell what El Ninos have been in the past that far back. But if the fog is decreasing, it may suggest that El Ninos have been increasing as well in times before we've had historic records. Yes.
Are you aware of any studies that are looking at the sea level rise that continues to propagate through San Francisco Bay and into the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta? And do these mapping tools address that more inland inundation possibility?
Yes, they do. This particular mapping tool does. And lots of people working on the Delta. Yeah, we're only, 25 feet above sea level here, Sacramento in some places. So on some of those longer-term projections, you may have beachfront property. You never know.
How do they get accretion, I think? Accretion rates, are they looking at sediment transport downriver systems?
I don't know the answer as to where they get the accretion rates from. I think they're just assuming, whatever process brings the sediments to the area. I don't think they've incorporated that into the modeling like with the Cascade model that's coming up from the Sierra Nevada and moving processes down to the Bay Area. I don't think they're using that information to then plug into the accretion rates. I think it's just a matter of, what accretion rate do you want to assign to this particular site? Because there's many areas in San Francisco Bay that are declining in their sediment values, sediments going away, and there's other places where it's accreting. So what we may end up doing is having to dredge from some areas to place into other areas and even it out, because it's not the same all over the place. But we may be able to utilize some of that sediment that's accreting more in some areas to replace the stuff that's missing in the other areas.
In your introductory part, you were talking about the new AR5 projections, but I had the idea that the bulk of those projections were in the order of a half a meter by 2100. It looked like you were showing about a meter. Am I just misinterpreting what you said?
There's differences in the sea level rise in different regions. It's not going to happen the same all over the place, but for the average of a global average, it's different than what we see in regional. When I showed that one figure that showed Washington, Oregon, and California, surprisingly, we have higher projected and predicted sea level rise values on the West Coast than we do in other areas and above the global projections. So it's not the same everywhere. Like I showed that global map, it's accumulating more in the western part of the Pacific. So there's differences in different areas and regions, but these figures that are from the AR5 are looking at and projecting global sea level rise values. That's probably why the difference occurs.
Why would it be higher on the West Coast outside the fact that you haven't had an El Nino for a while and maybe it's gone west?
They're not doing it.
Just a few inches.
Right. They're not incorporating El Ninos. It's just a projection of glaciers melting, expansion of water, and all of the other factors that go into sea level rise. Why it's exactly higher? Why it exactly is higher on the West Coast than in other areas? I'm not a modeler and I'm not running those programs, so I can't answer that. I'm just taking the data that they're providing.
Enter anything else? Oh, okay. So we have another live.
Question on impact of climate change, weather change on fish and wildlife. Any impact or studies on what's occurring with fish and wildlife on the interior of California? I know this year we were busing salmon to the ocean because of the drought. Any studies that are looking at the long-range impact on fish and wildlife?
Oh, sure. But I was asked to look at coastal systems. So, yeah, there's lots of studies that are looking at terrestrial systems, absolutely, and on fisheries. Yeah, that's another story.
Anything on WebEx? Any other questions from the live audience? Last time?
So just moving forward into some of those additional questions that we had and thinking about, how we might incorporate this into our management and adaptation, activities. So being a marine biologist and working in the marine system and thinking about these extreme storms and how we might be experiencing those more frequently and therefore having some additional or more disturbance going on in our systems, it seems to me that we need to be thinking about being a little bit more cautious in how we're approaching our management. Has there been any, are you aware of any studies or anything like that in that area?
First, what do you mean by cautious?
Well, we always talk about precautionary, so we add some, for instance, if we're going to harvest a certain amount of fish, then we reduce that amount by a certain percentage to be precautionary.
Well, what I would say to that is to probably take a look at the Climate Indicators Report by Benet et al. And Duncan et al., rather, Benet Duncan. That provides both physical and biological indicators of climate change, and I think that your program needs to be keeping track of what kinds of changes are happening in the environment. And with the group that they had assembled of marine scientists around this area, state, federal, local, and different kinds of organizations, I think they came up with a very good set of processes and indicators that should be monitored on an ongoing basis. So at least take a look at that and see if that's consistent with your agency in terms of what you want to be monitoring, because that group identified what appeared to be the highest risk species and the highest risk physical indicators that should be taken into consideration for any conservation planning. So that might be worth looking at.
Anything else, live or WebEx? Okay, I want to again thank Dr. Tom Suchanek for joining us today. And before we close off, just want to also announce our next class. It's scheduled for Thursday, June 5th, 1 to 3 p.m. at the Sonoma County Water Agency facility in Santa Rosa. Dr. Bill Seidemann from the Fair Lawns Institute will discuss climate change impacts to pelagic ecosystems, and Dr. Bill Peterson from NOAA will discuss changes in plankton distribution and abundance. We look forward to seeing and hearing from you there. And please check our website. I have the URL at the bottom of this slide as well for details on class location. We have yet to post them, and we will be archiving Dr. Suchanek's talk either, if not end of this week, probably early next week. So again, want to thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.